mentioned Gleevec as the reason your CML dropped so dramatically. Are you aware of Gleevec being used elsewhere for AMLs and so on?
It has been used, doesn't work for AMLs. It works in some forms of stomach cancer, what is called GIST tumors, and it works in some rare other myeloproliferative disorders. There are some drugs that are more or less akin to Gleevec, distant relatives of Gleevec, that are being developed for some subtypes of AML. AML is a very complicated disease by itself. One could spend hours talking about that. There's not just one type of AML. There's 50 types.
Yeah, sorry. Gleevec treats the CML, doesn't it?
Yeah, treats CML.
After transplant, if you can't get off of GVH, you can't get off the drug.
Oh, Gleevec has been used for some forms of GVH. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah, Gleevec has been used for some forms of GVH, and there's some excellent results reported. I have never used that yet. There's a small Italian group who have reported they treated like 20 patients with very severe GVH of the skin, and like half of them improved. And so we have thought about, and there's a reason for that. There's a mechanism underlying that, where it's thought that Gleevec may interrupt the sequence of events that is causing this form of graft versus host disease. I have no personal experience with doing that. I just never have had to deal with that yet.
I was surprised to hear you say that you've had some patients on their immune suppression drugs for 5 to 10 years.
So that's true, and so I would say 80% of the patients are off by a year. So if I have 100 patients, 20 are still going to be on medication for at a year after transplant. A large majority will be off. Of those 20, they will come off little by little, and after. These are all patients with quite serious graft versus host disease that are difficult to control, and those patients can stay on their medications for a long, long time. And the longest, I have one lady who is now 10 years on medication. So, but it's very, very, very rare, and it's a contrast. Now, I hear people sighing, but it's often better to deal with medication than to deal with having serious GVH. And there are some patients who really, the only way one can control it, it's not very common, but it's the reality. And over time, everybody gets off. But there's some patients, that particular lady that I think about, over these 10 years, I have 3 times tried to take her off, and every time she had a major bout of graft versus host disease. So, we have these general rules and general statements, but every patient is still different. And some people are... Now, that lady also, she was 54 when we did her transplant. She's now 64, and she's still working full-time. And she has led and she's a grandmother 12 times over. And, she's still on some Prograf and taking 10 milligrams of prednisone. And she's taking medications for osteoporosis, but she's been perfectly healthy, and she's not set a foot in the hospital. So the way to think about that is it's a chronic problem. There's people who take blood pressure medication the rest of their life. There's people who take, diabetes medication. So it's not something we want, but it's something we sometimes have to deal with.
The longer that you're on cyclosporin and immunosuppressants, do you find that patients, it's more difficult for them to come down?
Well, again, if we have to keep patients on, if you're on for a year, you're probably going to be on for 2 years. Most patients, and then after, there's a statement that after 2 years, if a lot of it fades away. And the majority of patients, there's like a group of patients who do really well in the beginning and come off right away. Then there's the group of patients with graft versus host disease, and the majority will go off after 2 years. And then there's, some patients where again, I've seen it improve. I mean, I'll use that same patient. That same patient is, now slowly going off it. I have other patients after 6 years. But you look pretty good, for example. I don't know, So again, it's the same issue. If you need it without the cyclosporin, or I don't know whether the cyclosporin or Prograf, you might have a lot more problems. So it may have been a life-saving drug for you. But it's why one patient is different than another one, we have no idea. Again, that lady that I talked about had a sibling donor, had the best donor possible. And why that happens, and we don't understand. But some people have major trouble with these drugs, other people just tolerate them fine. But it is more difficult than being off medication, that's for sure.